Maybe? Yeah? Okay. Very good. All right, we are in the 7th class of Hebrews, as you can see. And so I wanted to point out a couple things that we've gone over so far, some themes to remember. That is way too small. I apologize for not making that text bigger, but I'll read it off to you anyway. So some of the themes that we have been covering, going all the way back to the very beginning of Hebrews, is the idea of the sonship of Jesus, how Jesus is the Son. We also talked about the idea that Jesus is better than you name it, right? So far it's been angels. We're going to move into Moses. That's what we're going to cover in chapter 3. We've also talked about Jesus as our high priest, okay? We're going to see more of that, and that's actually going to be a huge theme later on in the book, but it's one that's ever present in Hebrews. And then also Jesus as the ultimate fulfillment of God's promises, his revelation, however you want to phrase it. Jesus is that ultimate fulfillment that was talked about in the Old Testament, and now he is here, right? So before we read that, I want to get maybe a little bit of a running start and look at Hebrews 2, just to give us a little context for what we're moving into. So in Hebrews chapter 2, I'll start in verse 17. So Hebrews chapter 2, verse 17. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers and sisters, it's talking about Jesus. He had to be made like his brothers and sisters in every respect, so that he could become a merciful and faithful high priest in things relating to God, to make atonement for the sins of the people. For since he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are tempted. Therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, who was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant, to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son, and we are his house, if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. Oh, did I do it again? I apologize. This is going to be rough if I did this for every slide. Okay, so 3 points that I want us to consider. What we read just now, there's 3 things that are going to come out of this. It's the idea of the servant versus the son. Versus might be a wrong word. They're not necessarily at odds with each other or adversaries, but comparing the role of a servant versus the role of a son. Okay? We're also going to look at the different roles that Jesus and Moses had with respect to God's house. And then we also are going to see God's promise with respect to Moses and Jesus. What I would like us to do as well throughout the entire book of Hebrews, but especially now because we're really starting to step into Old Testament territory, talking about high priests and the Levitical system and things like that, keep in mind a Jewish perspective. I realize that we did not grow up in Judaism, at least I don't think anybody in here has, but I think we have probably learned enough that we can sort of try and adopt a mindset that a first century Jew might have with respect to how they view sacrifice, how they view atonement, how they view Moses, how they view God's revelation, things like that, okay? So, what's interesting to me about this part of the text, we can clearly see that it is comparing Moses and Jesus. There's no way you can't see that. But what I find interesting is the author is not derogatory towards Moses. It very easily could have pointed out the flaws of Moses or the things that they had done wrong or things like that. But instead, it just presents it as, look, this is Moses. Now I want you to look at Jesus. They're actually showing how Jesus was like Moses, but in a much greater way. And by showing that to these Jewish readers who had a high reverence for Moses, that they might instinctively turn their reverence from Moses to Jesus. And it's not because not that Moses was bad, so to speak, but that Jesus is superior. So I found that kind of interesting. Let's look at the first verse here. There's this very peculiar phrase that refers to Jesus as the apostle and high priest of our confession. And I think this is the only place in the Bible where Jesus is named an apostle or called an apostle. So it's worth asking the question, what is an apostle? Now, I know Kerry brought this up in his previous class, so I feel like we could answer this. What is an apostle? I heard something. One who is sent, okay? That's one way of describing it. Another way, kind of in the same vein. A messenger, yeah, somebody who brings a message, one who is sent. Our English word apostle comes from the Greek word apostolos, which is a messenger. Someone who's sent as well, right? Sent with a message is the implication. And it's used primarily of messengers of God. It can be a generic term for just somebody who's sent or somebody who is a messenger, but it's primarily used for those who are sent by God or with a message from God. It's used to describe prophets, it's used to describe preachers, and it's also used to describe the famous 12 apostles who were specifically chosen by Jesus. Okay? So that's an apostle. What is a high priest? Think back to the very, very first class. What is the high priest and what do they do? Robert?
I have more of a quick question.
Okay, go ahead.
Is this one of the first times in the New Testament Jesus is called the high priest?
First, I'm not sure, to be honest. Robert asked, is this one of the first places that Jesus is called the high priest? I guess it maybe depends upon your definition of first in chronology, as well as, Psalms talks about you're a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. That's referring to Jesus, is how Hebrews will later. Specifically in the New Testament, yeah. I don't know. My guess is probably yes, but I'm not certain of that. But don't quote me on that. Anything else? What is a high priest? What do they do? What's that? They make intercession between whom and whom? Between God and man. They're a mediator between God and man, right? So we're kind of using certain words here. What do you mean by intercession?
Like they represent you in front of God.
Oh, very nice. Like they represent you in front of God. I actually like that definition a lot. What do you mean by mediator? Okay. Okay. So the mediator is somebody who is in between man and God, and they meet them in the middle, so to speak. Is that a fair way of saying? Okay. I don't disagree with Robert.
The high priest is the only one that's allowed to be in the presence of God when you have God's presence being represented on the Day of Atonement on top of the mercy seat in the most holy place.
Okay. So Robert makes a good point that the high priest is the only one who is allowed in the presence of God on the specific Day of the Atonement where God would actually dwell upon the mercy seat, which is that top portion of the Ark of the Covenant while it was housed in the tabernacle and the temple later. So yeah, I find that highly significant, and we'll get into that much, much, much later. Not in this class, though. So anything else? Yeah, I think we kind of covered this already. The high priest is set apart and holy to God. I find that interesting as well. He commands that in the Torah. The high priest also makes atonement for the people. And remember what we talked about that word atonement? It's just this weird, scrunched up compound word that means at one-ment. They are made at one They are brought together, they're reconciled in a way, right? The high priest makes atonement for the people and acts as an intermediary between the people and God. So, the Hebrew writer says that Jesus is our apostle and high priest. How is Jesus an apostle? He was sent by God, so keying on that idea that he is sent. What else? Any other thoughts? He brings the good news, sometimes also referred to as a message. Yeah, he was a messenger, right? He brings a message. He brings the good news for sure. I'm not saying you're wrong. But I really like that word, the message, right? Or the messenger, because this appears over and over again in just the first 3 chapters now that we've looked at in Hebrews. It's the idea of focusing on the message. What does it say? If we neglect so great a salvation, right? If we ignore the message that's brought by Christ, okay? So he is an apostle to us in that sense. He is sent by God with a message for us. How is Jesus a high priest? Hebrews is going to expand on this much, much more later, I promise. But what are your thoughts? He's holy and set apart, absolutely.
When we pray in his name, aren't we having his help to mediate?
Yeah, I believe it's actually in Hebrews where it talks about how Jesus is making intercession, to use the word that you talked about. He makes intercession on our behalf. So praying in Jesus' name, Jesus even told his disciples, anything that you pray in my name, right? So it's that idea that Jesus does intercede on our behalf, perhaps even acts as a mediator. Again, keep saying this over and over, beating this dead horse. Hebrews will expand much more on this idea, right? What else does he do that chapter 2 or 1 has talked about, Jackie? Go ahead. Sacrifice, yes. So he becomes a sacrifice and thus makes atonement on our behalf, right? One of those real big things that he does on our behalf. So, how do these 2 roles function together in Jesus? Jesus embodies the role of the apostle and high priest just like Moses did. And we'll talk about this in a second. An apostle represents God to humanity. He brings the message of God to humanity. And the high priest represents humanity to God. Right? This is how we see this. Jesus represents God to us. He's God in the flesh, right? And then he also represents us to God. He makes intercession on our behalf. He makes atonement. Moses functioned a very, very similar way. So I wanted to look at this verse right here. Not chapter 2, chapter 3, verse 2. Jesus was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. Okay, so now we have a very clear comparison with Jesus and Moses. My question to you is, what does house mean in that verse? Because remember, it's not just Moses, it's Jesus as well. So the author is saying Jesus was faithful in God's house, as was Moses faithful in God's house. Both of them were faithful in God's house. Nolan.
Wouldn't that be God's holy realm?
God's holy realm, that's an idea, right? What else, Mona? Okay, so the dwelling that God made for his people, and this was kind of what I was keying on, that Moses perhaps had a different type of dwelling, if you will, versus Jesus. Relationship, yes, absolutely. So we have a couple options with what does it mean by house? And just sort of our common everyday language, we can even understand this. You don't have to dig very deep. When we talk about a house, it could mean like a house. You drive and somebody lives inside of it and you knock on the door and it's like you're at my house. We can call it a dwelling, an inhabited building. We can come up with all sorts of fancy words, a residence, things of that nature. But we can also describe it, we can use it interchangeably with something like a household. The famous verse that Joshua utters, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." He's not talking about his dwelling actually serving the Lord. He's talking about his family, his household serving the Lord, right? So we have this idea that it's a group of people, perhaps, a family of sorts, a tribe, a household, right? We have a few options to play with. This is why I bring this up. So let's start with Moses, and we will see how this ties in with the previous verse. If you look at Numbers 12, verses 4 through 8. If you want to turn there with me. So, what are some possibilities that would qualify Moses as being faithful in the house of God? Like we see that it could be these different options. So this is where that phrase originates. I'm going to read this whole thing. The Lord spoke immediately to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. The three of you come to the tent of meeting. That's the tabernacle, by the way. The tent of meeting is the tabernacle. So the three of them went, and the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent. He then called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forward. The Lord said, "Hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known to him in a vision. I will speak with him in a dream. My servant Moses is not like this. He is faithful in all my house. With him I will speak face to face, openly and not in riddles, and he will see the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" Interesting. It sounds like the Hebrew writer knows the Old Testament or something. So how is it that you see, Moses being faithful in all of God's house?
Well, if you look at his life and his relationship with Israel, he obviously was very significant in the sense that he says in the passage there, he actually would be in the presence of God. And you can see positive connection to that with Jesus, but he was held in very high esteem.
Okay. So Moses was held in high esteem by whom?
The people, of course, God.
Okay. So the people held him in high esteem. With respect to the word house, do you see the people as being the house in that sense? Okay. So I don't disagree with you. I think that applies. I also think that you can go with perhaps a more physical structure like the tabernacle. Yeah. Absolutely. I think there is a dual reference here, and to echo what you said, how Moses is almost like a foreshadowing or a type of Jesus to come with respect to how he interceded for the people, the relationship he had with God, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And go on and on about that. We see this same type of crossover that's being built. So these are two things that I kind of came up with that describes how Moses might have been faithful with respect to God's house. I don't think you have to be exclusionary. It doesn't have to be one or the other. I think there is a dual reference here, okay? So the tabernacle was referred to by the Israelites as God's house. Even though God clarifies, I can't actually live in this, the point remains they saw that as where God dwelled. And perhaps, in some sense, he did dwell there whenever he went to meet the priest. Moses, while not necessarily given the title of priest, functions in large part as a priest for the people. Psalm 99:6 reads, "Moses and Aaron were among his priests." Okay? In Exodus 2, Moses is described as being from the tribe of Levi. In Exodus 19 and 20, he served as a priest at the inauguration of Israel as a nation, and at Aaron becoming the high priest. Moses was the one that physically had to inaugurate these things. He also sanctified Aaron and the tabernacle. He served at the altar. He also made atonement for the people at times. So Moses, if you want to view him as being like a priest within the actual tabernacle, the house of God, if you will, this is how he was in fact faithful. If you want to see him perhaps as being faithful to the household that is Israel, which I see that more in line with an apostle, if you see where I'm going here, he brought a message to the Israelites from God. He taught the Israelites God's commandments in Deuteronomy 6. He brought God's law physically to the people in Exodus 34, and he delivered God's message to Pharaoh in Exodus 6, and go on and on with other examples, but you get the point. I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think it crosses over both, and I think there's a reason why, because it's touching on this idea of being both apostle and high priest. Okay? So, does that make sense so far, or have I just totally lost everyone? I got a couple heads nodding, so I'll take that as we're doing okay. I'm going to move on. We're going to tie this back in. Okay? In Hebrews 3 and verse 3, it is quite clear how the writer explains this. Let me have my Bible open so I can go over this with you. Okay, so in chapter 3, verse 3, "For he has come to deserve greater glory than Moses, just as the builder of a house deserves greater honor than the house itself." So the author is continuing with this house analogy, right? This isn't random. They're making a very strong argument, and they're tying a lot of things in. And they're making a comparison between the honor given to the builder of the house versus the house itself. We can intrinsically understand, like, no matter how amazing a house might be that's built, just the most fantastic structure ever seen or created, it would never amount to the honor due to the person who built it. That doesn't take a lot of explanation. We just know that. The creation is not worthy of as much honor as the creator, right? And so now we see that the author says Jesus is worthy of more honor than Moses. There's an implication that they're still making. It's continuing this thread from chapter 1 all the way into chapter 3. There's an implication being made by the author right here, just in that verse itself, right? The idea that Jesus is worthy of more honor in the same way that the builder of a house is worthy of more honor, okay? So now, verse 4. "For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that would be spoken, but Christ is faithful as a son over God's house. We are of his house, if in fact we hold firmly to our confidence in the hope we take pride in." So the author tells us in verse 4 that the builder of all things is whom? I apologize, what was that? God. The builder of all things is God. And then they give a description of Moses and Jesus within that house. So what was Moses' role as assigned by God in that house? He was a servant. What was the role of Jesus in God's house? That of the Son, okay? Do you see what's starting to separate now? It's like we start off kind of close, like Jesus and Moses are similar in some ways. See, they're like kind of fulfilling a similar role, but now what's happening? They are starting to drift, and maybe this way, up and down as opposed to left and right, starting to drift far apart with the analogy that the author is using, and also some of the word choices that they're using as well. Okay? Jesus was the son, Moses was the servant. And we know being the son is a more honorable position than that of the servant. The author of Hebrews spent most of chapter 1 and 2 explaining that idea, and here it is once again. The son is worthy of greater honor than the servant. What's more, what did the author explain about the son in chapter 1 and verse 2? Does anybody remember that? Chapter 1 and verse 2, what is it about the son that would apply in this situation? He is an heir. What else is the son? The radiance of God's glory. And one more thing that I want to throw in there. He made the world, so he makes all things. He is the radiance of God's glory, or perhaps even the exact imprint, if you take the next clause of that, the exact imprint of God's essence. And he is the heir. As we've talked about before, he is both God and man. He is both son and the one who was placed at the right hand of God. He created everything, yet inherited everything. I'm not going to say that, that makes perfect sense. There is a paradoxical nature to it, but at the same time, when you understand who Jesus is, which is the whole point of Hebrews, it starts to become very clear. He was the Son as God forever and ever and ever, and came to earth and inherited the same thing that he created. Okay? Here's what I think is really neat. Let's turn to Luke, So the Son has created all things. They also inherit all things. What does this mean about God's house, then? It's the Son's house as well. Can you recall a passage where Jesus talks about himself as being part of a building? The cornerstone. That's exactly what I thought of. A very famous passage. Let's turn to Luke chapter 20. And I think this ties in very nicely with this idea of being the Son as well as that cornerstone of this building. That's a good one too. Cornerstone was the one I was thinking of, though. I don't doubt you, though. Nolan had said, upon this rock I will build my church. So Luke chapter 20 in verse 14. So this was the parable of the tenants, and I'm going to skip most of that portion and then jump right into verse 14. But when the tenants saw him, that is the Son, they said to one another, "This is the heir. Let's kill him so the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. This is what Jesus was saying in this parable. When the people heard this, they said, "May this never happen." But Jesus looked straight at them and said, "Then what is the meaning of that which is written? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on the stone will be broken to pieces, and the one on whom it falls will be crushed." So what do you think? It wraps up this entire idea of sonship as well as this idea of this building that Jesus is going to be the foundation on, all in one nice, succinct way. If we look in some of these New Testament passages, I'll read some of them, we can see that we are, in fact, God's house. And our foundation is in Christ. We no longer have the tabernacle, right? We have something greater. And that is the formation of Christ's body, God's temple in us. 1 Timothy 3:15, and Paul's writing to Timothy, of course, "In case I am delayed, to let you know how people ought to conduct themselves in the household of God, because it is the church of the living God." Right? It's this idea that it's not a tabernacle or a temple, it is the church of God, right? The church is this household of God. 1 Peter 2, verses 4 and 5. "So as you come to him, a living stone," talking about Jesus, "a living stone rejected by men, but chosen and precious in God's sight, you yourselves, as living stones, are built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, and to offer spiritual sacrifices that are acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. 1 Corinthians 3:16. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit lives in you? In case it wasn't clear enough, Paul writes again in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 19. So then, you are no longer foreigners and non-citizens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of God's household, because you have been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the cornerstone. In him, the whole building, being joined together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together into a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. So any thoughts about that idea that I think personally that Hebrews is driving at? The idea that you have Moses being faithful in God's house, and then Jesus, of course, himself being faithful in God's house, and that idea of Jesus being an apostle to us in the same way that Moses was an apostle to the Israelites, as well as Jesus being our high priest, and Moses functioning as a high priest as well. Obviously, you can see which one is greater. A tabernacle, even with its specifications by God, or even the temple itself, once upon a time, the specifications from God himself, is that greater than what Jesus has established in us? I think it's a very strong, unequivocal no. This is what's greater. What Christ has done in establishing this house, in building this house, and being faithful in this house. So when we look at verses 5 and 6 of Hebrews, we can see that the ultimate fulfillment in Jesus, we can see that ultimate fulfillment in Jesus, where it talks about, let me turn there. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that would be spoken, but Christ is faithful as a son over God's house. Moses was faithful as a servant to testify to the things which would be spoken of later. What were the things that were spoken of later? We've been saying his name all night. He's speaking of Jesus. He's speaking of the Son. He's speaking of the Christ. So we already have another one. Moses was bringing a message about Jesus, and Jesus is that ultimate fulfillment. He is here now. Much, much greater. Moses was a faithful servant to God, but now we have the Son that's been revealed in all of his glory to us. How much greater is that than what was testified before? We are of his house, if in fact we hold firmly to our confidence and the hope we take pride in. Because Jesus is that ultimate fulfillment of the testimony that Moses said so long ago, and it is in him, Jesus, that we ultimately place our hope and confidence, and no longer Moses. This is what the author of Hebrews was trying to drive at with the people that he was talking to. Not to essentially abandon the Old Testament. I think that would do a huge disservice and be somewhat disrespectful to what God was saying, but instead to show that the Old Testament was talking about something that is now fulfilled, and it's here now. How much greater is this, what you have now, as opposed to what was back then? So, any thoughts or comments about this section? I was really hoping to get through all of chapter 3, and as soon as I read the first 6 verses, I was like, nah, we're lucky to get through these 6. James.
Think about the differences in that, in the first Moses versus Christ, is that Moses, a faithful servant, and then Christ, a faithful son, is that also when you look at it on a deeper level, Moses was a faithful creation, and Christ was a faithful creator.
Okay, so I want to lean on that just a little bit. Moses was a faithful creation. I think that's pretty easy to see. What do you mean by a faithful creator? I'm interested in that.
Well, as the son,
Mm-hmm.
as the Word of God was with God
Mm-hmm.
from the beginning, he is the creator versus Moses and all the other people that existed before. They were just creation.
Okay.
So going back to him being a more perfect high priest as a creator, the separation between man and God, since he was God in the
Okay. I guess it made me kind of think, it made me sort of think out loud, or rather, made me think. I'll save it for another time, or we can talk afterwards. But yeah, I like that idea. Robert.
I hope this doesn't get us down to the rabbit hole, but if it does, feel free to ignore this comment. But when I look at verse 6, where it talks, where you have this juxtaposition of Christ as faithful, my translation says was faithful, yours says is, but as the Son, I go back to almost chapter 2 where it talks about Jesus leaving the throne of heaven and becoming as man, that faithfulness was demonstrated by Christ's obedience. And maybe I'm reading too much into that and stretching that, but to me, it seems like that's more so talking of how as the Son of God made flesh corporeally on earth, that he was faithful to God until death, and that's really what that statement is referring to, that Jesus demonstrated his faithfulness. And I think one thing that is implied, that if Jesus is found to be faithful, that also implies that he could have been unfaithful. That he made the correct choice and served as a faithful son obediently. And that is, it shows his faith, shows that he is deserving of his place in the household.
No, I agree with you with no exceptions. Robert brought up the idea that Christ was faithful in his service as the incarnate Christ, the Son who came to earth, took on flesh, and lived a perfectly obedient life to God, and thus was faithful in that respect. I agree. I think that's encompassing that. I think it also encompasses the idea of service that is now being done. And I draw that mainly from the previous chapters of this book, where it talks about this idea that Christ was in the pre-incarnate sense, as well as while on earth, and even now in heaven, is all of these things, right? Mitch.
In verse 4, it talks about every house is built by somebody, but the Lord of all things is God. 1 Corinthians or Colossians 1 talks about Jesus creating everything. What I find interesting is that house that Jesus creates, his church, the only way he can create that, even with all his glory and power, is to come down as a human and be sacrificed and die. So that's why Jesus is so magnified and so great, is that as God, he came down and created something that he couldn't do from heaven. He had to come down and live a perfect life and honor himself. And because of that, he's one that should receive all glory and praise from us. Because without that house would not have been built. He could do it with heaven.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting thought, and that's why I kind of dwell on that idea that was said in verse 4. So for those who couldn't hear, Mitch talked about the idea that Jesus was unable to establish a church without having first come to earth and dying on our behalf and giving himself and all of the spiritual theological implications that go with that. And that's why I really tend to focus on verse 4 of chapter 1, where it says, so it talks about how he is God, and so when he had accomplished cleansing for sins, it implies that there was not cleansing for sins at that point. Something had to be done in order to cleanse sins. We can get into a weird discussion about, does that cover all of the sins prior to his death versus the future? We can have a discussion about that later, but I think the fact remains that he did, in fact, like you said, Mitch, had to come to earth to accomplish something. And that, to Robert's point, is what makes him infinitely better. He is not only God himself, he was subject to the same follies that we have in the flesh as human beings, and yet overcame all of them, was perfect and obedient and conquered it, and thus was appointed back to the right hand of God. Nolan.
I think chapter 2, verses 17 and 18 express that pretty clearly.
Yes. Yes, Nolan brings up chapter 2, verse 17 through 18. Very much so, the idea that he came to earth and he had to be made like us in every respect so that he could sympathize with us, that he could be a faithful and merciful high priest because he knows us intimately, not from afar, so to speak, as the God who sits up high and is afraid to get dirty with us. Instead, he came down into the muck with us and came out clean, if you will, and knows us perfectly because of that. So, any other thoughts, comments? Oh, yeah, sorry, Jackie.
I was just going to say how the beauty of this part of Scripture not only highlights the supremacy of Christ, but it also demonstrates how we have the closer access. It's better, this new covenant is better than the old because the last one was exclusive, and like you said, he came down and made God accessible to us. And that last verse that we covered tonight kind of talks about how we are his house.
Yeah. So Jackie makes a great point, the idea that this is better than the old covenant, and God himself even revealed it that way. I believe it was to Jeremiah. We have a better covenant in the sense that we have more intimate interaction with our mediator, with our high priest, right? He knows us intimately and is faithful and merciful to us at all times, and he's perfectly able of offering atonement on our behalf by himself. Doesn't need something else, doesn't have to wait for a special day. He is just there for us all the time. And so, yes, I 100% agree that this shows the superiority of what Christ has brought. Full stop. Okay, we are out of time, so I thank you all for your comments and questions, and look forward to seeing you next week.